Hello, we're meaning making, telling our stories with a conviction that you are a story too.
My name's Andy Griffiths.
And my name's Imogen Nay.
So, what we're doing is we're having a series of conversations about meaning making, and this is the first one. And we're very much hoping that we'll be able to tell the story of lockdown and emergence in ways that help you, other people, to tell their stories too.
And Andy, we're aware, aren't we, that the way that we tell the story at the beginning is perhaps different from the way that we're telling the story now.
Well, is that right for you? I mean, Imogen, in your case, at the beginning of this whole lockdown thing, how were you telling the story then?
I think I was in a bit of a state of shock. And the person that I sort of reached out for was Julian of Norwich, just because I knew she was an anchorite. And that was a very quick link to suddenly being in lockdown and isolated. So I went back and reread her revelations of divine love and thought about her sitting in her little cell in the church, isolated from people. And I found it an enormous encouragement because here was this woman who met with this extraordinary loving God in what seemed to me to be quite an extreme life choice to sort of wall yourself into a church.
Yeah.
And she lived through the plague. You know, her husband, they think, probably died of the plague, and her firstborn child, or her only child, we think. So here was somebody who was locked down out of choice, living through the plague. And so connecting with her really, really helped me. And then I suppose I thought about the whole Christian tradition of the spirituality of silence and contemplation and drawing close to God through silence. And that really held me in that first initial phase of lockdown.
And now, has that changed?
Yeah, I think as the shock passed and as we learned to live through this different experience, new rhythms developed, and I got in with the cathedral team for leading online prayer, and there were Zoom meetings, and then there were children learning at home and finding ways of providing resources for the cathedral congregation. And so a whole new way of exercising Christian ministry developed. And it seemed to be then a really creative time full of opportunity, a time to reimagine church and society. So I went from shock, I suppose, to a creative phase. But what about you, Andy? How was it for you?
Well, I think at the beginning of lockdown, a lot of us had a diagram, something like this, in our minds. I mean, I think of it as a bit like the sinus rhythm that you get in medical dramas, and I expect in real hospitals, but I only know it through the dramatic version. So it starts with the old normal, the old flat line, and then it goes up because at the beginning of the crisis, there's a lot of adrenaline about and the heroic phase, as it was called. This diagram was shared by a group of American ministers and psychotherapists, of whom the best known name is Nadia Bolz-Weber, right at the beginning of lockdown. And then there's a crash when the honeymoon is over and we discover that people aren't as nice as we thought they were, and we have to recover. And the recovery generally takes a lot longer than the crash did and that the heroic phase did. So at the beginning of lockdown, I remember that people like me, who were writing kind of MailChimp emails to ministers around the place, were pointing people to this reality and saying, please flatten this curve. Please don't wear yourself out being heroic, because it's a marathon, not a sprint. And there's likely to be cliff edges where your mood goes down. And it helps at the beginning of lockdown if you know that that's going to happen as time goes on.
And was this, in fact, the way that you experienced lockdown yourself?
No, not really. No, um, I I don't think it was like that. I think there was a bit of heroic at the beginning. I think that was right, but I'm not sure that the cliff edge and then recovery model really helped me very much. Maybe there were some others that it helped more. Um, I find the way I tell the story now varies with who I'm talking to. So sometimes I tell the story of the early days of lockdown with a sort of sepia tinged nostalgia, as if it was a global Sabbath and the moon was bigger than normal and dolphins were swimming in the Venice canals, and wolves were coming down from the Pennines.
Yeah, it seemed a time of infinite possibility because humans had stopped, but then.
Well, yeah, exactly. But then what? And sometimes I find that I'm not telling the story with any nostalgia at all. I tell the story as if it was a hardship or a nightmare, though, if I'm honest, it's been a very small hardship for me. Um, I, my encouragement in all this is that God seems to be as inconsistent a testimony giver as I am. So if we look at the Bible, we get the book of Hosea. And Hosea includes a testimony from God about the years when the Israelites were wandering in the wilderness. Uh, and God makes it sound like it was a honeymoon for Israel and God, or like it was like teaching your kids to walk. But then you read Ezekiel chapter 20, and in Ezekiel 20, well, this is God speaking again about exactly the same time period. But in Ezekiel, God seems just to remember how ungrateful Israel was from the very beginning and how rebellious they were from the start, and God didn't enjoy it at all. So it's the same basic facts, but even God tells two different stories. So I think it's okay for us to tell our lockdown stories in different ways as well.
I think that's really, really interesting, Andy. Absolutely. And sometimes we look back and we see things in one way, and then we look back and we see things differently. But what I'm really aware of is how diverse these lockdown stories will be. Some people live in big families, some people have been completely isolated, alone, some people have been working really hard, some people have been ill. But what really counts, I think, and what both of us want to say is how important it is that we tell our stories to each other. And we're going to be doing some meaning making soon. So thank you, everybody, for listening to us.